But hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in DC for another PICC event. Some of my favorites have a few have happened here, but all of my favorite events out here have always something to do with Ambassador Curiel, but that's just personal preference. My name is Lisa Abrego, and I am a Boilermaker who graduated in 2013, and I have been in DC since, largely because of PICC and Ambassador Curiel. I am honored to be here today to introduce a personal role model. She's a person whose claims to fame are many. Most recently, to little surprise, she was named one of the top 10 journalism educators by Crain's News Pro. She's ready to give us all her critical thoughts on civic education, participation, and obligations in a populous time. So please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of PICC, Ambassador Curiel.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you all for coming tonight. We hope we have a really interesting discussion for everybody. We've gotten some really interesting questions already for our event tonight, urgent conversation on the state of civic education. I'm grateful to Lisa and all of our former students who are here today, who are making their careers in Washington. Former students, would you please stand? Let's hear it for them. We have 10 interns, current interns, here in Washington. I think most are here in the room. Would you please stand? Also grateful to our special partners, C-SPAN, the polling firm Penshone Berlin, and the Washington Post, of course. We could not do our work without our PICC advisors, and several are in the room today. Lisa Abrego is one of them, Katie Cahill, David Kuznett, John McConnell, Joey Marburger, Matt Meller, Dale Pupillo, and Ian Urbina. Thank you all. Let's hear it for them. Our chairman of the board and C-SPAN founder, Brian Lamb, could not be here tonight. He had this really good excuse. He's in Ireland. But the co-CEO of C-SPAN is with us tonight, and I'm delighted she's here, Susan Swain. Susan, where are you? Oh, thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Valerie Strauss and I met years ago, I won't say how many, on the foreign news desk at United Press International. For those under 30, a newswire like UPI was like Twitter, Snapchat, and every reliable news feed and news magazine all rolled into one. It reported from around the globe with humans, none of them named Google. Valerie Strauss was one of the best journalists we had there, and she remains tops in her field as a reporter, writer, and editor. Her blog for the Washington Post, The Answer Sheet, is informative, entertaining, and always insightful in how it puts education at the center of everyday life and consequential decisions. Valerie Strauss is must-reading, and we're happy she's here tonight. Please welcome our moderator, Valerie Strauss.
Thank you all for being here. Now you know who I am, and you know who Carolyn is, and now I'm going to tell you who Josh White is. Josh is the Washington Post editor of the Americas desk. He runs a team of reporters who essentially cover the whole country. Before that, he was actually my boss. He was the education editor at the Post for 4 years, and he was responsible, the brains behind some of our best journalism. He led the Post's famous dissection of Rolling Stone's famous, she's shaking her head, she knows, University of Virginia gang rape allegations, which turned out not to be true. And he led an award-winning series on sexual assault on college campuses. He was also a military reporter covering the Pentagon, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he embedded twice in Iraq with soldiers during the war. So now you know all three of us. Format's going to be very simple. I'm just going to make a sort of some broad, basic comments and raise some questions about civic education. And then the ambassador and Josh are going to speak a little bit, and we're going to bring all of you in early, because those are always the best discussions when we can bring you in. I have some questions that some I believe students have written, and they're really good questions. So we'll start with those, but this is going to be mostly audience participation. So here we are here to talk about civic education. What is it? People think they know what it is. Most often the definition that we hear is preparing young people to learn about how their government works and then to be informed citizens and participatory citizens, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean that if students learn about the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, that they are learning civic education? If they learn about the Constitutional Convention, how a bill becomes a law, is that civic education? Is that enough? I would categorize that under civic knowledge. That's not enough. And that's part of our problem today. People learn, kids learn from kindergarten through 12th grade in different ways, in different amounts, in different intensities about how their government works, and they retain very little of it, as we know from surveys that show that 4 out of 10 people don't know who the vice president is. And we have an additional issue in the last 20, 25 years of subjects that are not math and reading getting short shrift because of the No Child Left Behind law and the intensity of accountability systems that only look at test scores in those two subjects. So civic education there's a new urgency about it now, because we are in an unprecedented era in this country right now. Our politics are woefully polarized, and we have a president who has, without a doubt, challenged basic democratic fundamental principles that are espoused in our Constitution. He's challenged the freedom of the press. He's challenged the independence of the judiciary. And the truth is, millions of people think that's okay. And so the question is, what do we do about it? How do we infuse more of not just the knowledge, but civic skills and civic dispositions into young people? Because it's not just learning about facts. It's learning about what it means, what a democratic principle is. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how schools don't, or a few do, but how they can do that, what a school would look like if it really created a democracy that students participated in, other than electing a student council that hosts a prom. And so here we go. Carolyn, we're going to hear from Carolyn first.
Okay, thank you. So, the state of civic education. There are surveys that show the more people can name the three stooges than can name the three branches of government. It's true. We have a problem. When the overwhelming majority of states don't require passing a civics test to get a high school diploma, we risk producing a voting age population that doesn't know the workings of government and has no appreciation of obligations to community and nation. We don't burst into this world automatically as competent, responsible, and contributing citizens. That has to be learned through instruction that includes civic experience and application as participants in society. Civics is, in my view, societal glue. That would be my definition. And without it, segments of our population are easily persuaded that there is no common purpose to America. And then, instead of one out of many, we are headed in the opposite direction. The founders knew that. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and an early advocate for public education, and he said, "There is but one method of rendering a republican form of government durable, and that is by disseminating the seeds of virtue and knowledge through education." This is where we have to allow that schools are the constant, structured influence on young people, offering credentialed, formal instruction on subjects children need to succeed. So this blind spot on civics is significant. Making this more serious is that even with a low bar, there is inequality in civic learning achievement. The gaps favor whites over Hispanics and over Black counterparts. And across racial and color lines, there are civics achievement gaps evident by income. I'm going to close with a little bit of hope because there was a recent piece I took note of by the self-described conservative columnist Bret Stephens in the New York Times. It was called "Only Mass Deportation Can Save America." And he wrote, "The United States has too many people who don't work hard, don't believe in God, don't contribute much to society, and don't appreciate the greatness of the American system. They need to return whence they came. I speak of Americans whose families have been in this country for a few generations, complacent, entitled, and often shockingly ignorant on basic points of American law and history. They are the stagnant pool in which our national prospects risk drowning. On point after point," he wrote, "America's non-immigrants are failing our country." He then cites data on our native citizens' failings on crime, educational achievement, business creation, and even perpetuating ourselves by birth rate. He writes, bottom line, so-called real Americans are screwing up America. Now, this may have been a little bit of Jonathan Swift and a modest proposal, but it was illustrated with pretty telling statistics about citizens' investment in America versus the contributions of immigrants. So, what I took away, there is a ready and eager pool of people who maybe can reinvent the dream and perpetuate the republic as the founders intended. And civics education is critical for them and for everybody else too.
Great, thank you. Josh?
So as education editor at the Washington Post and now America editor at the Washington Post, I actually see a large element of our role as civics education. We are playing, and I think now in some ways more than 6 months ago, an increasing role in what people are learning, how they're learning it, in part because we're reaching so many more people in the online world, but also because I think people have realized that maybe they didn't know enough going into November. Whether you appreciate the outcome or don't appreciate the outcome, participation levels, the anger, a lot of the violence that we have seen over the last 6 months is related in part to people who feel disenfranchised in one way or the other, whether by previous administrations or by the current administration. And one of the things that Valerie and I talked a lot about when we worked together was the inequities of it all. You all had civics education. You all are where you are because you believe in making this country a better place, in putting in hard work, in achieving. The people who need civics education most are not sitting in this room. And the likelihood that they are going to get it is much lower than the likelihood that the people who come up behind you will get it. And one of the challenges that we see is the competition between dealing with educating all of those people in very basic things like reading and math and testing them in those subjects to ensure that they're learning at a fair rate. The accountability piece that Valerie mentioned works in both directions. It ensures that people are learning those things, but doesn't ensure that they're learning anything else. And so you end up cutting out all the things that don't fit those tests. So what goes first? These types of educational areas, civics education, literature, things that can help you understand the context of the things that you're learning. And so as we look at covering this nation and trying to explain what's going on, we're often, as a newspaper, explaining these things to people who aren't, they don't have the same base. They don't have the same starting point. And a lot of what we're seeing in our coverage is people who don't understand how the country works. And that, for example, voting can make a difference. That not voting can make a difference. That having a voice can be very real and important. And if you, as many have seen, the clashes at Berkeley, in Portland, in many other cities, the extreme factions are fighting physically, but they're also fighting for attention. They're fighting for people to understand their perspective. That polarity makes it very difficult to teach everyone the same thing as people kind of identify with one side or the other. I think one of the most important things as we look at how to teach civics is to create a baseline that everyone understands going in so that they know how they can make a difference, not just with their voices in the streets, but in many other ways, trying to achieve something, trying to get to a place in society where they can make a difference. Seeing that making that difference is incredibly important to the future of the country. Whatever that difference is, whatever your political persuasion, whatever your issue is, knowing that working within the system will always be better than trying to attack the system after a bad decision or after something that you don't agree with. So it's something that I see as fundamental to the way this country will work. And at this moment, it's actually more important than it's ever been. Not because people are upset with what the system produced or didn't produce, but because the argument that people are having now is often because they don't understand the system at all.
Thank you. Before we open it to the audience, I'm going to read a question here from a student that I think gets to some of the big strokes about this. It says, do you feel that civic knowledge should be taught through formal education, or do parents need to instill the importance of a civic engagement at home to truly make a difference? So that speaks to the issue of whether schools can do it alone. And my feeling is that schools can't do it alone, that communities need to be part of it, that families need to be part of it, that social organizations need to be part of it. And, you know, in America, we've had lots of things have splintered. People don't belong to as many social organizations. They've gone off their own way in technology. As the ambassador said, people have different goals now. That there isn't one goal for everybody, like there used to be when, for example, there were 3 television networks and everybody watched the same news. We had these common experiences. And so, I think that schools can't do it alone because it's not just about learning the content. It's about learning, for example, Josh said that people are screaming to have their voices heard. Well, one thing to be a good citizen is that you have to be able to work with other people and listen to other views without demonizing the other person. That's part of civic education. And so that doesn't happen in a little discrete, course called civics. And either of you want to tack on to that?
Go ahead.
I think one of the main challenges of that question is you have to take for granted that the people at home know the civics to teach their children. And I don't think we can assume that in a lot of cases. And it also assumes that the community understands what it is they need to teach their children. And I think that's why we empower schools as communities to help teach something that everybody can learn in an equal way. The example of not knowing the 3 branches of government, or not knowing where Wyoming is on a map, which is another thing that most Americans can't do. They can't identify states on a map. Relying on home to do that works in a lot of homes, but it absolutely does not work in a lot of others. And it's not because the parents aren't smart or capable. There are a million reasons why that won't work. People hold down 3 jobs, or they're unavailable, or it's a single parent household, or it's a no parent household. I think it's a good idea in theory where there is a family unit that can support that. But I think there are many, many circumstances where that would equal zero education.
I agree on all those points. I think that we are in a different era now where what I experienced growing up and what first got me civically active, my mother would campaign for candidates she thought would be helpful to our family situation. And so we would canvass door to door for a particular candidate, and little flyers and passing them out, and knowing what this individual would do if this individual got into office, and why it was important to support this person and to talk this person up. And I was maybe 7 years old at the time when I started doing this. What parent has time for that now? My mother was a stay-at-home mom, 7 kids, she was busy, but she found time to do this. It is a completely different era, and I think we have found ourselves really wanting, in so many other ways on the home life, the need to support a family when wages have been stagnated is an overwhelming one. And I think 3 jobs is not an unreasonable thing that we hear from people, that they will work on a weekend, they'll work night shifts in addition to day shifts. And so it comes down to, am I going to work this extra job, or do I spend extra time basically homeschooling the child on what's important? And there are families that homeschool, but they too are hard pressed. And I think that the schools cannot do it alone, but I also think that they're not doing what they do already well enough. It is incumbent on the structure that is in place to find a way to improve what is being offered to students. It's a critical situation when the education that should be coming to students on basics doesn't include the very reason that education and public education was institutionalized for this nation. And so I'm really glad that Susan Swain is here from C-SPAN, because one of the things that I see as another bright spot is that parents will park their children in front of the TV. Let's face it, they just do. And if it's a morning and that parent is parking the child in front of the Washington Journal every morning, I would be very happy. Let's hear it for the Washington Journal. It's an education, it truly is, but I don't think there are a lot of parents doing that. I wish there were.
Here's one more question before we open it up for the 2 of you. It relates to when teachers do try to talk about current events as part of civic education. The question says, what is the best way to educate people about recent history without introducing bias? Or is bias reasonable if it is acknowledged and used to further discussion and debate? Ambassador?
Bias is inevitable, we're human. We try to remove as much of it as possible, but we are indeed human. And so the history that I learned and those of my generation learned coming up was very much male-dominated. The female role was not included. We now have a recent effort to include women and more minorities, or those who have been underrepresented in the history books, but we don't have a complete picture yet. And so there's naturally going to be bias going into it. However, the world was what it was. I think a generation now that is exposed to Hamilton, for example, sees a vision of the past that is idealized in many ways, because you have a multiracial cast taking on roles of white people that were the founding class of America. And we took, the Purdue Institute for Civic Communication took 50 people, most of them students, up to see Hamilton in Chicago last fall. And It was in November, and there was barely a dry eye in the house. It's such, students who are here who went, raise your hand, please. Did you enjoy it, would be my first question. And was it impactful? And so I'm getting nods, yes. So my big takeaway from this is history and civics lessons can be entertaining. It's not about making it a comedy or a musical for everything, but the dry formula that has been used, that I was exposed to in school, just has not been very successful. Every measure shows that. And I would love to see more efforts to produce historical recountings of civics as students have not been exposed to. I'm going to pick on Susan Swain again from C-SPAN. One of the most brilliant series that C-SPAN has done has been on the First Ladies. Things you've never heard of that Susan Swain produced and hosted. You don't get that typically. It's the kind of thing that you think, I now know so much more about our country and the thinking that went into its formation because of it. So.
Thank you.
I mean, as someone who fights bias with every single minute of my day, one has to admit that bias is in everything, and probably most so in teaching in some ways. Look at how the Confederacy is taught where I grew up in the Boston area versus how it's taught in Mississippi. Imagine how many Confederate monuments are there in New England versus, say, Texas. How do we look at important moments of our history? Again, growing up in the Boston area, we learned a lot about the Revolutionary War. We went to all the famous sites where these things happened because they were around us. We spent almost no time talking about the Civil War. It was almost an afterthought. We read Gettysburg. The difficulty, I think, is that it is extraordinarily important to separate the personal view from what you're teaching as much as possible. And I say possible because I'm going to go back to the election. We wrote story after story in November and December about students who were crying in their classes and other students who were celebrating, teachers who were taking the issue in jest on both sides. Is that appropriate? Is it appropriate to look at a presidential election in America as having a positive or negative outcome to an 8th grader? And I think a lot of that crept in. We saw it happening because people had very strong views in parts of the country that had very strong views. One of the challenges is, I think, that we don't want to support an outcome necessarily when we're talking about civics education because that implies right and wrong. That implies that one party is better than the other, or that one process is better than the other, or that low voter turnout can be good, or that high voter turnout can be good, or what does it mean when the cities vote a lot and or don't. I think we have to analyze these things as much as possible neutrally as we try to cover them in journalism in order to give the students the ability to make up their own mind. Yes, there's going to be bias. Any teacher who has a feeling about something is going to impart some of that in everything that they teach, just as we all do in conversation and in interactions with each other. But what I think the question brings up, and as we talked a little bit about, it's important to separate that bias for the purposes of educating, but I think also important to share the bias so that people can understand where you're coming from. That bias and that discussion is how we learn. And the big problem overall is that we tend to stick together and hear the opinions that we want to hear and discuss these important issues with other people who already agree with us. The most important thing of all of this is to hear the other opinion, engage it, discuss it, understand it, because they're not wrong. You think they're wrong, but they're not wrong. They just think differently than you do. And I think if we're going to understand and acknowledge those biases, we also need to understand that we're probably wrong in their eyes.
Who would like to ask the first question?
And we have roving mics that will come to you.
Anyone?
There we go.
Oh, where? Okay. Where did you point? Okay.
Ian Urbina has a question.
So everything you said, I think, is spot on. One thing that seemed to be in the background was the notion that there's both the content of civics education and then the delivery of it. And the delivery is a place where, as a father of a 13-year-old son and my wife is a teacher, I'm often watching these young people and where they get their information. And it's not the New York Times where I write, it's YouTube and it's Hamilton and it's, John Oliver and it's rap, contests on the internet and it's House of Cards. And so I guess, for better or for worse, I do feel like there needs to be a reckoning with the delivery system of the biased or unbiased narrative and figuring out how to better get at the 13-year-olds, or in the 15-year-olds, and sort of frame that narrative in ways that they'll actually consume. Because with the, again, all this, but with the sort of democratization or decentralization of information, they're kind of going right around the Washington Post and the New York Times and C-SPAN often, and they're going straight for what they want to consume. And I don't know that we as a society have caught up with that yet to kind of deliver. So it's more a comment than a question, I suppose.
I'll just make a quick comment. The delivery system, you're right. There are some scattered schools around the country that have done experiments with real democracy in the schools. And they have established committees with students on every single one of them who are involved in every single decision. If a teacher gets hired, if a principal gets hired, and students have democratic responsibilities that they have to that they're responsible for, and they have to make sure they do. And those schools are just, they're alive with thinking and debate and real learning in a way that most other schools aren't when it comes to these kinds of issues. So somebody once said, you can't teach what you don't model, what you can't model. And if schools have become, and they've increasingly become more rigid in the way classrooms operate, if you're modeling this sort of top-down process, that's what kids are going to come to know. And so I agree with you. I think the delivery system is vital, but there's really very little interest among the school reform crowd in thinking in these terms. This is not the issue that they talk about.
I actually think to take it a step further, what concerns me is they're getting their information in all those different ways, but that so many people are seeking out the information that validates their already held views. And it's very easy to find right now, whether true or not, it's out there. If you want to believe something, you can absolutely justify that with a lot of garbage that's out on the internet. And we are really endeavoring to figure out ways to infiltrate all of those areas. It's why the New York Times and the Washington Post are very aggressively on mobile. It's why we're on Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram. It's why a lot of these organizations are pushing to try to engage the younger set as much as possible. It's challenging because it's a very crowded market and it's very dispersed. But to the extent that we all can point out what's fake, what's really fake, and what isn't, to the extent that we can steer our children toward good choices. And it's hard. I mean, I don't have teenagers yet. My daughters are 7 and 5, but I read the paper every morning. I mean, I'm old school. I get my own paper, and I sit down with my 7-year-old, and we look at the paper. And she asks questions about the pictures and the headlines, and she actually asks, what did Trump do today? Which is what our paper's for, right? And I think to the extent that we can encourage those habits and model those good behaviors, we have a chance. But it's an ocean we're fighting and we're trying to hold back, and it's very difficult.
You may be the only father in America teaching a 7-year-old how to read headlines in a newspaper.
Maybe.
Another comment, question? Yes, sir.
I want to follow up on the gentleman from the other side. The question about education. I hear you talking about children, but how do we deal with the rest of the population? If I talked about Miranda versus Arizona, some of you might know it, but if I started to say you have the right to remain silent, how do we get beyond the Fifth and Second Amendments as common knowledge?
So you're talking about civic education for the general populace. Adult education. Anyone want to tackle that?
So if we're trying to get people involved, I'm a big believer in engaging people just generally. We have a spelling bee, why not a civics bee for everybody, right? We have a national lottery, we have state-by-state lotteries. Why not have people win for answering the right question? You only qualify if you've answered this question correctly. And you can't use Google, I don't know how you'd control that. But I think a lot of people have gotten to, I mean, okay, so the data have shown that the silent generation, those who were of the World War II generation and people basically over retirement age at this point, know a lot more than millennials know a lot more than boomers know. It's been steadily ratcheting down. And so what was different back then? A lot less information, just generally out there. What we've been talking about here, what was brought up with, you know, every show on TV being political, from entertainment to comedy shows that have very biting satire. It's not the healthiest way to get educated, but that's how people are educating themselves. So is there something that's being offered that would be as alluring as that? I think that's a challenge. But going back to the obligation of the schools, everybody here can remember their favorite teachers in school. And why was that? Usually they were very engaging, and they knew their topic in a way that nobody else did, or could present it in a way that nobody else did. And so I think teachers probably need to get better trained themselves. That's part of adult education, is educating the teachers. And then offer seminars for adults. Community centers have become very active on the civics education front. In fact, it can be said that education in civics has generally been privatized. It's not in the public schools in the way that's most effective. It's probably more effective in those efforts that have been privately or funded through nonprofits. So,
one of the great ironies that Valerie actually has pointed out several times on her blog is that the best educated adults on civic matters outside of people who went to college are new immigrants who have just received their citizenship. Why? Because they study it. They get a book, they study it, they know it. And they know more about our country than most people who live here. But because there's a goal, there's a reason to know it. And as you look at the college population, which is a relatively small percentage of America that people actually have degrees, they know some of that, not all of it, and oftentimes in very specialized areas. I think it's very difficult to educate people once they've left the system. And we let a lot of people leave the system unable to read. We let a lot of people leave the system unable to do much of anything, and that's what we've all been trying to fix as a society, is get people ready to do something after they leave school. You know, one of the things, not to go back to the media, which is the one thing I know best, but we are trying to educate that population as best we can, but you have to know how to read. You have to know to look for us. You have to want to look for us. And, you know, that's not everybody. There's a lot of people who, as you know, don't read English, so we don't serve those people. And how do we reach that population? Many of whom would love to be a part of our system and embrace it when they know what to do. It's a huge challenge.
It's worth noting that this kind of discussion they had 25, 50 years ago. There's always been an outcry that Americans don't know about their own government. The surveys that they take now that show illiteracy and civic knowledge, the same results happened 50 years ago. So some people argue that there really isn't a difference, except that people aren't learning as much social studies as they used to, because the courses that they used to give have been shrunk into one course. And today, as one of the student questioners has here today mentioned, everything's STEM. And so we've got this huge concentration for the last 10, 15 years, actually since Sputnik. But so the question is, where does civic education fit in? Who's going to make that important?
I would like to add on to that STEM and civics education are not exclusive of each other. One of the things that we've done at Purdue through this program was to make sure that university-wide students had access to the idea of civic communication, because we have engineering students who are part of our program. And I want those engineers to be able to think policy when they get out there, and impact on society, and how they can do things better for humanity, and all of that really good stuff. So I don't think they need to be exclusive, but they have been. They've been very segregated that way.
Right.
I think we had some questions here in the middle.
Sure.
Here in front, maybe?
You.
Sarah, you got them?
First off, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the input you're providing, the expertise. My question, to get to kind of civic involvement, my question is if you think there's a correlation between the fact that educational history books stop at 1945. You know, as someone who has a high school, college, and graduate degree, I took one class on civil rights in all of that. How do you see civic involvement from a generation who doesn't understand or appreciate the women's rights, the HIV epidemic in the 80s, in Brown v. Board of Education? As much as civic education should be focused, I mean, if there's no historical precedent, what do you think the relationship between that is?
Not all history books stop at 1945. Curriculum, right. But teachers can create their own, and they often do. I think part of what challenges teachers now at every level, more than it ever has, is the fear of being controversial, because they can get in huge trouble. And teachers, historically are supposed to be nonpartisan, non-political, but increasingly they're becoming more so, and no more so in this election. I've been covering education for almost, I'm not going to tell you how many years. It's a really long time. And I think I've never seen so many teachers wanting to speak out on school reform, on politics, on just the tone of the country, how kids are being raised. You hear teachers now coming out, but they do it at some risk. So that's how I can address that. I don't think that if the gut of your question is that kids don't know some of these things, I think that more of them learn about it than you might think. I mean, you can't just look at the history books.
But it is incredibly important to address all these issues, and we have to ensure that our schools, our communities are keeping these issues alive. I mean, one of the things that's kind of crazy for me, I graduated college 19 years ago. When I graduated college, cell phones didn't exist. People didn't have the world at their fingertips. You couldn't Google anything. In order to learn something that you didn't know about, you had to seek it out. You had to have someone explain it to you, or go to a library and find a book, or find a movie or a documentary that just happened to be on TV, because there weren't 200 channels and you couldn't record it easily. Now, with all of that information at our fingertips, are we actually accessing it? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I doubt that a lot of very young people right now are spending a lot of time researching these issues. And I think, again, it comes down to directing people to the right information, whether it's at home or in school. But you give a little kid an iPad and they're going to watch Barbie videos. I can speak from experience. And so the trick is to, okay, sprinkle in a little bit of something else that's important in that discussion. But again, it comes down to what we were talking about earlier. That puts a lot of onus on families and small communities. And it's very, very hard to change habits and patterns. Like your children will go to school and will go to college and will get a degree and will get a job and will do well. We already know that. They're not the people that I'm worried about or that you're worried about. The trick is, how do we spread what you want to achieve and what your family wants to achieve to everybody? And I know that's the question, right? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know that anybody does. I think we've been trying for generations to figure that out.
There's another tangent to what you said, and the current school reform movement, which is focused on school choice, actually is geared toward letting parents choose schools that teach them what they want their kids to learn. And that is a growing concern. President Trump and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos want to spend $1 billion on new voucher programs which use public money for private and religious schools. And you aren't going to learn about the HIV epidemic in a Catholic school. You're not going to learn about a lot of things about climate change in certain religious schools because they don't believe in it. So we are actually at a moment in education reform where what you're talking about could become a more severe problem. Yes, sir. Yellow tie.
I'm Mark Scheff. I'm a Purdue alum, although I graduated long before the institute was established. In 2016, many Trump voters were hurting, either economically or socially. They were angry at Washington and at the system, and perhaps their vote was a backlash. Many of them maybe thought he wouldn't actually win. But now that he's in office, and we're seeing how he's performing in office, is a second vote for Trump a demonstration of a fundamental disrespect for the presidency, or is that unfair to say?
That's a heck of a question.
A bit off target, actually, for our topic tonight. That's, goes back to, well, we would call that in class a loaded question. We would call that a loaded question.
No, I actually, I don't mean it to be loaded.
Yeah.
I'm actually serious about that because you talked about the system and not understanding the system and so forth. And in asking the question, I'm not trying to stake out a position. I'm really curious.
I will say this about our current state of politics. There is renewed interest in how things work and how they don't work. And we have a lot of people who are, for the first time perhaps, thinking about getting involved civically, even running for office. There are record numbers of women, for example, who very much want to jump in. They may not have ever considered this before, but call this what you will, it is an exciting time. It's historic. And these individuals who are thinking they'll get in want to have an impact on what is going on. So specific to what the election of Donald Trump means, I don't feel comfortable speaking to that, but I think it has had an impact in terms of civic engagement and in a positive way.
Well, and one of the, I'm not political, and I try very, very hard throughout everything I do in my life to not have a political opinion of any kind. We just did a poll of rural America in the Washington Post that published over 2 days, and I think we learned a lot about some of the areas that voted for Trump that we didn't know before. I think A lot of people were making assumptions about what people wanted and why they voted, and a lot of those assumptions were incorrect. We learned, for example, that a lot of the difference between rural and urban areas was not economic. It was actually cultural. It was a belief that people in cities don't agree with the lifestyle of people who live in rural areas, a disrespect for religion, a disrespect for wanting to not be in a city, right? And so I think trying to say why someone voted a certain way is very, very difficult to ascertain, and whether or not that vote is right or wrong for that person is, I think, irresponsible of me to address. But if you look at the presidency, a lot of the issues that have been important to the administration are issues that are important to the base that elected him. Immigration, jobs, the economy. Whether or not you agree with how he is approaching those issues, they are the issues that speak to the base that elected him. What happens in the next election, I think, is going to have a lot more to do with what happens over the next couple of years. And it's way too early to say what effect any of these policies or decisions are going to have, whether good or bad or indifferent. As we know, economies are cyclical, and a lot of things that are happening now would have happened anyway. Some things are happening that might not have happened. It's very hard to say. What I do think is very important, though, and about what we're talking about, is we can't vilify or put on a pedestal any of these ideas or politicians, because inevitably we're going to be wrong if we do one or the other, because no one is all or nothing. And we tend to look at things as all or nothing because we aren't trained not to. We listen to the people who are our role models, and we adhere to an idea. And I think one of the important things about civics education is that we can teach each other to listen. And I think one of the things that's very clear about society today is we are not listening to each other.
We have about 5 more minutes. Yes? Yeah, white jacket, you. Thank you.
Thank you. So my question is
Dr. Katie Cahill, formerly, very recently, my associate director for the PICC, and as this is the end of the PICC, she has moved on to the Howard Baker Center at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and we hope that she really, really carries through the legacy of this program.
I plan to. So my question is because of something that I've learned working with Ambassador Curiel. I have more computing power in my pocket than supercomputers did in the 1980s. And I know that because I just Googled it just 1 or 2 seconds ago. So my question is about what is the balance in terms of civic education between teaching people what to know versus teaching them how to think about civics. And I think something that the PICC did an excellent job of was teaching students how to challenge any information from us as their instructors, information that they read online, and to ask the right kinds of questions. So how do you balance that with the kind of content that they should know about civics, and how do you instill that in adults and young children?
Sounds like a Valerie question to me.
Oh.
It really does. It really does.
How do you instill it? The only way you can do it is by engaging people, engaging them in an engaging manner. We all know that schools are too often dry, the way materials presented. People, young kids, and older kids learn better through experience. They learn better using their hands. They use better by arguing, right? The Socratic method really actually works, but most teachers don't know how to engage in it. I think that when you think about civic education, as I said earlier, I think you have the knowledge piece, and I think that's vital. I think people do need to know what happened, who did it, how it happened, why it happened. I'm a content person, but I'm also, I also think people have to understand why and be able to critically think and analyze and challenge, just the way you're talking about. And for me, that's not just in a civics education class. That is across the board. That's in every class, even in our class. Again, that's kind of what I was talking about, civic disposition and civic skills, how people can learn to think about things. I mean, if you go into a voting booth and you don't know who's really on it except maybe one person that you decided to vote for, and you didn't read any of the referendums, does that make you a good citizen? You could say you voted, but you really don't know what you're doing. So in terms of K-12, I think we need a wholesale revolution of how content is presented to kids, how it's created, and what we do. I think there needs to be more integration of subjects, cross-curriculum, but we've actually gone the other way. Since No Child Left Behind, at that point, we needed actually we needed curricular reform. But actually what we got, instead of going the way to more openness and more expansiveness and more critical thinking, we actually went the other way. And you can talk to college professors now who will tell you that from 15 years ago to now, the kids come and they really can't answer challenging questions. They can't ask challenging questions. A lot of the top students, they know a lot of content, but they can't go further. And so I think that's what we need.
We actually did a project that attempted to make fun out of balancing the federal budget. We, every May, would bring a group of students to Washington, D.C., and we decided to mix it up a little bit. Instead of the usual presentation on the subject alone, they worked in teams. And we produced the prototype for a game that would be used to instruct 8th graders. And I still have a dream that we're going to make that prototype fly, because it was all but done. And our business school at Purdue expressed interest in it because they actually train teachers in Indiana who must teach the federal budget in the 8th grade.
That's great. Well, one more question we have time for, you
I think we do, yep.
Yes.
I love it, starting and finishing. But my question is, and I won't make it a long-winded one, but we've alluded to the power of social media. It's no secret that a lot of traffic, intentional and organic, comes from social to the Washington Post. And it has so much more breadth and depth than anything we've ever had before. So these civic knowledge and information education conversations have been happening, but now we have this like interconnectivity and resource. So my question to you is, what responsibility do you think that those social media platforms have, and how should they plan for the future?
It's a really good question, because the social media platforms are really just that. They're platforms. The users are really creating the rules, and those rules are shifting on the fly, sometimes by the minute. We are working with a lot of the very specific platforms to boost content. We look at a lot of analytics and a lot of data in real time, and you'll see, okay, Google, for example, will prioritize the outlets that it knows are reliable. It will push stories that are coming from the outlets that will provide an unbiased view or a thorough view. You'll see the in-depth tags, those sorts of things. It's not a problem, but the thing that everyone is struggling with is something goes nuts on Twitter. And that is an organic life that we have no control over, that Twitter has no control over, really. And it is almost entirely based on users. So it relies on users finding something important or interesting. And we're trying to seed that as much as we possibly can. We're trying to push out things, that are relevant, that are important, that are fast, to get ahead of the rest of it. I mean, this is my personal view. I don't really see Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all the other platforms that now exist as necessarily having much of a responsibility, so much as the content providers have that responsibility. And the way that we look at it as an organization is we need to be providing the information that the users need to have. And we need to be out there quickly and often and out in front of the big news of the day so that we don't allow the other users who are seeding badness to take control. And I think we're winning that battle in very small increments. And part of it, I mean, we see it because we see the traffic. And we are, you know, the numbers are all very close hold, but the reality is, you know, we just had our senior leadership tell us that we have millions and millions and millions of people coming to our site every month. And when I started working at the Washington Post 19 years ago, we knew exactly how many papers we sold, and that was exactly our reach. Today, our reach is exponentially larger, and it's almost hard to explain how much larger it is. And that's a good thing in that it has happened naturally because of those social platforms. A lot of people blame the social platforms for misinformation or for creating or generating momentum that is negative. The reality is it's actually expanded our reach and influence around the world. You know, we used to be for and about Washington. Now we're bringing the world and the nation to everybody. And that's a really exciting place to be. I look at the social networks as an opportunity, one of the greatest opportunities we've ever had. And that's kind of why when you look at why did Jeff Bezos buy a newspaper? It's the same reason why he built a company that sold books, right? It wasn't to sell books, and it wasn't to put out a newspaper. What we're trying to do is become the reason people are going onto that social network platform. It's to bring information in a way that no one else can. And it's a challenge, and it's going to take a very long time to do that. But we hope to drown out the noise.
I want to ask you, and actually everybody, a question. Should Facebook, when the story about Hillary Clinton running a prostitution ring out of a pizza joint in Northwest Washington appeared on its website, you know, patently ridiculous, should Facebook have pulled it? Do you think it was Facebook's responsibility to do that?
Sorry. I think that no, it shouldn't be pulled, unfortunately, but there are ways that we can encourage people to question what they're consuming. Because a lot of times people, like, I chuckled because it's like, of course you work at the Washington Post, you're giving me this answer, you have the responsibility to put out well-researched and good information that people will want to seek out. But the reality is that a lot of the stuff that people are putting out there was an article a few months ago talking about the person whose job was to put out these like sensational headlines with, for lack of a better term, fake news. And to me, it was so hard to read how someone would purposely want to mislead masses of people. And so I think that in an ideal world, a Facebook wouldn't have to do that because that wouldn't exist. But because it does, and because of the reach that a platform like it has, it can incorporate elements that will at least encourage people to question or think a little bit deeper than just taking things at face value.
One of the great difficulties of that, though, is you put, say, Facebook in the position of making judgments. And I don't know that we want that either. Because then what if an organization, let's take the name off of it, decides that one view is dangerous or that one race's view is dangerous? I don't think we want a gatekeeper that's deciding for us all what's real and what isn't. I think what we really need to do, and this is totally self-serving and I completely acknowledge that up front, is we need to boost and put a lot of support and attention on the places we know provide us with the right information. And I know this is like a plea to subscribe to the Washington Post, but it's a plea to subscribe to the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and USA Today and the places that we know we trust for information, so that there isn't so much bad out there. And we're in a really difficult spot because we are in a place where people in positions of responsibility have tweeted out stories from The Onion thinking that they were real. And that's gonna happen. And so how do you battle that? I don't know that I want an electronic gatekeeper telling me what I should and shouldn't read. I think we need to educate people to be smart consumers. That's what I think the solution is.
Thank you. Well, we're going to give the last word to Ambassador Curiel. We are done with our times. Thank you for coming.
I will keep it very brief because we've gone a little bit over here. First, to thank everybody for coming tonight, and to thank everybody who has supported the PICC over the years. This is indeed our last event. We decided to do it in Washington for good reason, because we've sent a lot of our best students here, and so I'm thrilled to see many of them here tonight, our advisors here tonight, our current interns here. We want to get photos, so don't anybody disappear. But I'm very grateful that for this final event, we had the benefit of Valerie Strauss and Josh White, and so let's please hear it for them. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.